All right. Well, it is 2 o'clock Eastern time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And I want to welcome everyone to establishing a scholarly communication baseline using Liaison Competencies to design scholarly communication bootcamp, part of a series of online presentations brought to you by the ACRL University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. I'm Alex Diekey, and I will be moderating this program along with my fellow committee member and colleague, Laura Garippi. This session is being recorded, and when the recording is ready, we will send the link of the video to everyone who registered for the program. Please post any questions you have during the presentation in the chat box. Laura and I will collect the questions and read them to the presenters at various times during the session. We also ask when you do put your questions in, be sure to change the audience, sure to change the to from all panelists to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see the questions that are coming. We'll also be posting a link to a program assessment in the chat box at the end of the program. So we just ask you to take a few minutes at the end to give us your feedback on today's program. I also want to mention that today we don't have tech support for this program from ALA as the ALA office in Chicago is closed because of the weather. So if you're having technical problems, feel free to send Laura or I a private chat message and we'll try to do the best we can, but just so you all know, we don't have our usual tech support. So with that said, I'm happy to introduce our 3 presenters, who are Cindy Shirkley, who has been a liaison librarian for 20 years and the head of collection development at ECU for 3 years, Jeannie Hoover, who is ECU's scholarly communication librarian and has led the research and scholarly communication department at ECU for 3 years and is heavily involved in the OER movement, as well as Katie Webb, who has been the head of research and instructional services at ECU for 4 years and has written a book on makerspaces, digital media labs, data visualization labs, knowledge markets, and digital humanities labs entitled Developing Creative Spaces in Academic Libraries, a Decision Maker's Guide. So without further delay, I'll hand everything over to our presenters.
Thanks for that intro, Alex. I'm Cindy Shirkley, and I'm going to start us off with a presentation overview. First of all, we'd like to talk about our current liaison model that we use at ECU, and to do that, we'll get into different liaison models because we're a mishmash here. We're going to talk about scholarly communication bootcamp for liaisons that Jeannie and I developed. Next, we'll talk about the development of new liaison competencies that all 3 of us worked on together. We will talk about future uses of the new competencies, and we'll have plenty of time for question and answer periods. We have some presentation learning outcomes. And first off, attendees will be able to construct their own liaison competencies documents based on a model provided by the presenters. Just a second, I'm having some technical difficulties. Let me just start over. Attendees will be able to construct their own liaison competencies document based on a model provided by the presenters, that's us. Second, attendees will be able to distinguish between concepts and example goals as the terms apply to a liaison competencies document. And finally, for learning outcomes, attendees will be able to identify topics upon which to base scholarly communication training sessions. Okay, now we wanted to do a couple polls because we're curious about what everybody else is doing. So if you could answer the first poll, do you have a current liaison competencies document that you use at your library? So yes or no?
A few more minutes and I'll close the poll here.
Thank you, Alex.
4 seconds, I should say.
Okay, so some of you do, but it seems to be much more common that you don't. A lot of you don't have liaison competencies documents, so maybe that'll be something that you can start thinking about after today's webinar. So
It's
great.
80-20 split.
Yeah, cool. 80-20 split. All right, and the second poll we wanted to do is, do you have ongoing professional development for liaison librarians at your library? And that can take any form that you can imagine, from lively lunches to boot camps to lectures to what have you. Okay, that's great. So it's, can you read it, Katie?
It's about a 60-40 split. Looks to be about 58% of you, or 61 attendees, said yes, they do have ongoing professional development, and 45 respondents said no, and that was a 42% split.
Okay, great. So that's really good. I'm glad to see that so many people are doing professional development for their liaisons, because I think it's really important. All right. So the next thing that we wanted to talk about is the liaison model that we use here at ECU. But first, we need to talk about current liaison models in general. In order to describe ECU's current liaison model, I'd like to talk about 4 common models of collection development departments. First, I wanted to talk about the distributed model, probably because it's the most common. And that is where liaisons spread across various departments in the library. It's very popular from the 90s and the 2000s. It's still very popular, and it's a common model. Next is the consolidated model. That is where you have a specific collection development department that contains all liaisons. This may overlap significantly with a reference department. This is sort of an older model, and a lot of times the people who staff the reference and collection development department are called bibliographers or reference bibliographers. So this also tends to be seen at very large academic institutions. A third model, and this is much newer, it's just the last few years becoming popular, is the functional model. And this involves having some traditional liaisons, and they can be from anywhere in the library, and also some functional specialists. And by functional specialists, I mean people who do a specific function as part of their job. For example, a data librarian or a copyright officer. And finally, the model that ECU uses is the hybrid model. This takes a little bit of the distributed, the consolidated, and the functional and mushes it all together. At ECU, we have a collection development department with 3 full-time people in it, a full research and instructional services department, and a scholarly communications department with a head of scholarly communications and a data librarian. And finally, we also have a copyright officer. Now, we recognize that we're a large academic library and have the luxury of specialization. However, we will try to address how to do things like start a scholarly communication boot camp if you're smaller. Now, we wanted to talk about the previous liaison competencies. So I've got an example of what they looked like up on the screen. And this is basically the top half of the liaison competencies. And you're seeing what looks like a checklist. It was task-focused, easily achievable, short and to the point, spreadsheet format to foster a checkoff mentality, and it was divided into level 1 and level 2. And generally, people who worked full-time in research and instructional services, or RIS, were expected to know just level 1, while people who were part of collection development department were expected to know levels 1 and 2. We decided to phase this out because it started to become a little bit problematic, mostly because it was a document that concentrated more on tasks than concepts, and we wanted to emphasize overarching concepts. We wanted liaisons to engage with scholarly communication and collection development concepts in more meaningful ways.
Okay, thank you, Cindy. I'm going to take a few moments to talk about our Scholarly Communication Bootcamp and sort of how they came to be and the types of topics that we cover on them. So Cindy and I started our Scholarly Communication Bootcamps in fall 2015. And to give you a little bit of background on what was going on at our library, at this time, our Scholarly Communication Department was expanded to build on work started by our Assistant Director for Research and Scholarly Communication. And with that, we added the Scholarly Communication Librarian position. The bootcamp was really developed for 2 reasons. One, as a way for liaison librarians to keep up to date on scholarly communication trends, and also to become familiar with new services that we offered at the library. It's important to note that our library director and our assistant director were very supportive of the boot camps and also encouraged us to develop it. In our first year, the boot camp sessions were offered to liaison librarians at both our main and our health sciences libraries. Liaisons could attend either session, whatever worked best for their schedule, and each session usually focused on 1 or 2 topics. And I'll get into the topics in a few minutes. To encourage more discussions, we used a flipped classroom approach, which required liaisons to review materials prior to the sessions. And these materials might be anything from videos to webinars to blogs to any other kinds of articles, that type of information. We would then spend the session discussing the topic or doing an activity. For more information about our bootcamp, we do have a link to our Charleston conference proceeding on this slide that you can look at. So this is just a summary of the kinds of topics that we've covered on our bootcamps over the past few years. When we first started out, we had 7 sessions that first year, and in recent years, we've actually decreased that. So now we're averaging about 2 sessions per semester. We tend to revisit topics, and the ones that we revisit probably yearly are digital scholarship as well as copyright. And then we also revisit topics if there are new updates or if we're offering new services in those areas. I also want to note that we've asked colleagues to help lead sessions on various topics, and this has come in where a colleague might be really interested in a topic, or it might be something that is taking up a big portion of their position, so they wanted to, they're the best person to lead that session. So we wanted to give you just a couple examples of what we actually cover during our sessions. So we have 2 examples to share. This one is our copyright session. And I do want to note that there's so many informative and open resources out there related to scholarly communication that we really use a lot of those types of resources for it. So most of our time was spent compiling and selecting resources that were freely available, and then also developing the activities or discussion questions that went with it. So these are the readings for our copyright session. We asked liaisons to watch an archived copyright webinar led by Christine Fruin and Anne Gilliand, which was organized by ACRL. And then we also, since that was a full webinar, we also asked liaisons to look at an infographic developed by ACRL on best practices for fair use. Our activity for that session was actually a series of copyright scenarios. Each scenario was based on a question that we had received from faculty or students over the years. We spent the session discussing the readings as well as working through the scenarios using the 4 factors of fair use. I'll also note that we've provided a copy of these scenarios for you to use and edit, and that link will be shared at the end of these slides. This is another example of what we covered for author rights. The required readings, we had various readings here and no webinars for this one. It was a conference presentation by Pascal Lupin, a Spark author addendum, and then the description of Sherpa Romeo. The main activity for this session was Sherpa Romeo red light, green light. And so for that activity, we asked liaisons to come to the session with a laptop or computer, and we asked them to pull up an article on a topic that they were interested in. So everybody picked something random that they wanted to look at. They were then asked to go to the article references, and from there start looking at the reference journals and start looking them up using Sherpa Romeo. Depending on the self-archiving policy, they would either move forward in the red light, green light activity or stay or potentially move back, depending on what the journal policy supported. And then the last thing that we've done with our boot camps is we've assessed the boot camps every year that we've done them. And those assessments have evolved over the years. They've ranged from a pre-test, post-test on gauging how comfortable liaisons were with different topics to answering quiz questions. We've used those results to really build this boot camp the following year. And on this slide, I included 2 questions that we've had in our most recent assessment. This quiz did take some time for liaisons to fill out, but it did give them the opportunity to go ahead and use some of the tools that we have discussed in our boot camps. So before we move forward with our new competencies document, we wanted to take a minute to see if anyone had any questions related to the liaison models that Cindy covered or our scholarly communication boot camp.
Hi, yeah, we have had one question come in. This is Laura from the committee. And that question is from Annie Johnson, who asked if you all have a digital scholarship center and or librarian in this larger context of your liaison model.
No, we don't really. We have a bunch of people who have little pieces of that job, and we have a lot of what would you call it?
Interest and excitement about
yeah.
digital humanities and digital scholarship, but not one person who's related to that task at the institution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Several more questions coming in now. Someone asked if you could please describe the red light, green light Sherpa Romeo game in a bit more detail.
Sure. So with that, what they would do is they would pull up an article. We used our one search box, and they would find a topic. I think Cindy, what was your topic?
I always used sleep paralysis and alien abduction as my basic topic because it gets some pretty funny articles.
So once somebody put in a topic, they pull up an article and they would go to the works cited or the references for that article. And typically, I think what most people ended up doing is they could pick any of those references. So they could go in order from first one listed to something that looked interesting. And they would take that journal title and then go ahead and paste it into the Sherpa Romeo search box and look at what the policy was set for that. So if, for example, it was a green policy and you could deposit like the published version of the article, then you went ahead and you moved forward 2 spaces. And then if it was like a white policy or something like that and there's no information available for it, you had to either stay where you were, potentially move back depending on how you wanted to arrange the red light, green light.
There was a game board on copier paper that we had handed out that people kept track of where they were located at. So when we handed out raffle tickets for prizes, it made more sense that way.
Excellent, thank you all. Could you all speak to any awareness you might have about an existing liaison's competency model through ACRL or any other professional organization from which one might draw foundational principles for adapting and building upward local policies?
That's a good question.
Well, we are going to talk about some of what we based the new competencies model on. Katie will be talking about that. We did not really get into checking ALA so much as looking at individual schools. And I don't believe ALA has anything, but I could be wrong. I could be wrong. So that's something that I'll have to look at after this.
Okay, great. Thank you. We had two questions come in that are somewhat related, so I'm going to combine them a bit, which is how many liaisons you have and how well attended were these sessions and were they required or optional?
We have about 10 liaisons across the board, and that's including like music and our curriculum center liaison who does children's lit. And the sessions were strongly encouraged, but not mandatory. And they were pretty well attended. I don't know if you're going to talk about this later, Jeannie, but we did do a raffle the first year. People got a ticket for every session they attended, and then when we did games, they got tickets if they won. We gave tickets for other things too, but the prize was a $50 gift certificate. Both Jeannie and I put up $25. It was a small sacrifice to to pay for creating what turned out to be a lot of buzz. And people really wanted those tickets. And it was a very successful marketing ploy.
Excellent, thank you. And Paige Mann also just asked a similar question. Paige, I think they may have just answered your question about incentives and buy-in. If you have a follow-up, I'll let you add it to the chat box. Just to bring to everyone's attention, it looks like we've got a few folks adding some information about competency docs that might exist. So feel free to take a look at the chat box. And then it looks like the last question also kind of related to incentives and participation is whether or not you specifically incentivize taking that quiz. And I'm sorry if you might have covered that when you were talking, I was collating questions.
No, we did not. No, so we shared it and we asked them to take it, but we didn't necessarily.
And there was one reminder, but it wasn't a nagging thing. I took the quiz. It was not overly difficult, or, I think it took me about 30 minutes because you did have to go out on the web or onto different tools.
Katie is our foreign languages and literatures liaison. So she attends these bootcamp sessions and can speak from the point of view of an attendee.
Yes. They are well attended. I would say out of the 10 people, we probably get 60 to 70%, or like 6 or 7 people attending at each of them. So it's well attended.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that covers the questions that have come in so far. Attendees, please feel free to keep populating as our panelists forge onward with the presentation, and we'll collate questions for the end.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the process by which we rework the competencies document. And to explain, I'm Katie Webb, so I'm going to be talking about these next little bit. So Cindy already pointed out on a previous slide that our former document was a checklist in a spreadsheet format. But early in 2018, the presenters you see here met with the Assistant Director for Collections and Scholarly Communication to discuss the need for new competencies and to form a working group. We conducted an informal review of the literature and also looked at some of our sister schools' competencies, as well as some standout schools like Cornell. The document we were most impressed with came from our sister school in the UNC system, the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Some of the things that we took from their document during our meetings were that they had used learning outcome language in a document format, that they split their lists between learning objectives and best practices. We knew that in the past, the librarians at ECU had used this document, our previous document, to craft personal goals for their collection development duties. We wanted to give example language to be clear about the work that was to be done, but we also wanted to make this document our own and, even though we were looking at UNCG's, not make it exactly like theirs. We decided to expand our existing competencies to include teaching and learning, since many of the RIS librarians also had some collection development duties. We also made a shift from their best practices to have example goals instead, due to the fact that we were using this for training, goal setting, and the like. The format of the example goals uses similar language to our institution's SMART goals for faculty and departmental objectives. SMART goals, as you can see on the infographic below, mean that the goals are specific, measurable, attainable. But we do not set a time in the example goals, so they could easily set this to fit the timing of a semester or an academic year as it fits their own schedule. On the next slide, we're going to see an example of this in action, but the top level is going to be a description of the main topic, which we're calling concepts or competencies, and then the bullets below are going to represent a scaffolded method for attaining a competency for the concept. And lastly, once the document was completed, we sent it around to research and instructional services, to collection development, and to the scholarly communication teams. We also built buy-in and received feedback on wording by having a large group meeting with all three of the teams in the room together. We found that as much as we work together on projects individually or in small groups, this is one of the only times in recent memory where we had all been together in one really big, large group. And the meeting was also attended by our assistant directors. So you may be asking yourself, what's in this document? And I'll start out by outlining some of the completely new material that came out of the project. Prior to working together, there had only been collection development and scholarly communications competencies. After working together on these competencies as a project, I also came up with some research and instructional services competencies, which we reviewed together in the working group and in the large group. Although these competencies were brand new for the document, they weren't created in a vacuum. The RIS department had reviewed a number of ACRL documents in the prior goal cycle, including the framework, the roles and strengths of teaching librarians, and the guidelines for instruction programs in academic libraries. When we reviewed them, we talked about ways that we could improve ourselves as instructors and as a program, but we had expressed a need at that time for formal competencies that could be used in goal setting and training, and we were looking for a way to incorporate these documents that made them our own. So the idea for these competencies for RIS came from our actual practice of things we knew we had been doing, and then this review of these documents. Put another way, it codified what we had been doing, but it also set expectations for what we could be doing in the future. So I have an example goal here on the slide, which includes our existing initiative with curriculum mapping. As you can see, the concept at the top outlines what the competency means or entails, and then below it, under the heading example goals, there's a bulleted list of example goals. The example goals start at the most basic level and then get a little bit more advanced. Other topics that we included beyond this example goal were teaching, assessment, providing outreach, as well as creating and maintaining LibGuides, tutorial videos, or other learning objects.
So we came up with new competencies for collection development as well. With these new competencies, we're giving liaisons room to decide how they want to learn. We're telling them we want you to learn these few things, but you can pick and choose among the goals, or even come up with your own goals to get it done. So the example goals are definitely examples. And you can see on the screen one of the concepts and then the set of example goals for collection development. And it's the first one: communicate to library users in your area about changes in the library and encourage faculty to attend workshops, webinars, and forums. The other concepts in the collection development section are develop and manage print and electronic collections for assigned subject areas, manage collection funds effectively and efficiently, monitor research and publishing trends in assigned subject areas, and contribute to accreditation reports and new program applications. So you can see that a lot of this is stuff that we were doing as liaisons. It's just now kind of codified into these concepts and put down into concrete terms. And with each of these concepts, there is between 1 example goal and up to 8 for collection development.
So talk a little bit about how these competencies are applied in scholarly communication. In addition to it being flexible as far as liaisons picking how they want to learn a competency, the scholarly communication goals also tie into work that liaisons are already doing in their regular duties. In total, scholarly communication competencies, there are 9 of them. So while there is a lot, most of these topics are covered or will be covered in our scholarly communication boot camps. The scholarly communication competencies was, as Katie mentioned, shared with both liaisons, research instructional services, and the scholarly communication team. We also have a scholarly communication committee at ECU, so that those competencies, at least that section, was also shared with them for some feedback. So I've included the competency for our copyright area, and you can see the example goals listed there. So as far as applying these to future boot camps, I do want to say that as far as the competencies go, liaisons should be able to meet multiple example goals under each competency if they attended a corresponding session. So that's really what we will be focusing on to make sure that everything is covered. This spring, we're going to be focusing on copyright. So we will be sharing the competencies with our copyright officer so that can help her with her presentation. And the bootcamp sessions will also address some of the sample goals like we mentioned, so they can check those off as needed. Finally, Cindy and I are building a handbook and as well as some modules for new liaisons that cover these competencies. So for the last couple years, we haven't had new liaison areas, but this year we're getting some new liaison librarians. And I do want to mention that this is a living document. So as liaison work changes and as our campus needs evolve, we can revisit the competencies and update them as needed, as well as update corresponding competencies for the boot camp. And I will turn it back over to Cindy.
So we wanted to talk a little bit about the future use of the competencies. One of the big things that we wanted to accomplish with creating these competencies was developing a way to train new team members. And we just got a new science librarian on board, and Katie is using the document to train her. And one of the things that is nice about the document is that it's comprehensive, yet it's only a few pages, so it's not really overwhelming for a new librarian to work with. So that's a definite plus for it. We are using it to develop programming, like Jeannie said. She talked about that in depth, so I won't go into it again. We are also using it to create a handbook and modules. Jeannie talked about that as well, so I won't go into that. And finally, we're using it for benchmarking for annual goals. Liaisons will be able to use example goals as goals for their own personal documents if they desire, or they can use them as a jumping off point and create new ones. But they will be encouraged to deal with the competencies in their goals documents for 2019 to 2020. And that's something we do every year. We create an annual goals document, each of us, And I will be talking with the liaisons as to how they can incorporate these competencies into their annual goals.
All right, well, we know that not every school is large enough, or may I say lucky enough, to have both or all of a head of collection development, a head of scholarly communication, and a head of research and instructional services. So you might be sitting in your office thinking to yourself, how is this going to work for my institution and our specific needs? Well, we came up with a few suggestions that you can use this to modify for a smaller institution. For the scholarly communication boot camps, in the same vein as our quiz, you could survey your team to find out what they need to know and then make sure you just spend your time focusing on what they need to know. You could form a community of practice. And what I mean by this is not everybody has to be, you don't have to just have one leader. You can have multiple leaders where you each go out and learn something new and then bring it back to the group. So small, in your department meetings, have smaller, shorter sessions. You can share back what you learn at conferences. So there are sessions that are somewhat like a scholarly communication boot camp, and then if you're able to attend that, or one person is, they can bring that information back. One of the things we do really well here at ECU is that we have people report out what they did at a conference, what sessions they attended, and I love reading those documents because I always learn something new. So lastly, watching webinars such as the one you're watching now can be something that you can do in lieu of a boot camp. And then lastly, for the competencies document, you could use our document as a jumping off point. It is in our IR on a Creative Commons license, and that will be linked in the chat and on the shared afterwards. So feel free to use that document as a jumping off point so you don't feel like you're starting from scratch, and then base it on what you're doing and what you hope to accomplish. And again, ours is a living document. You can start small and then build it bigger than that. Finally, I just want to say thank you for all tuning in. That's what we have to share with you today about our competencies document and the scholarly communication boot camps. But Alex and Laura have been monitoring the chat, and we have plenty of time to take other questions as they come into the chat. So we're going to stop speaking right now and then answer your questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Katie. First question I've got on the list is, were there specific competencies that the liaisons were most anxious or concerned about, or any that they disagreed on?
Oh, I'm trying to remember in that meeting if we had any.
There were no disagreements that came up as far as what the competencies stated. That was addressed during our big group discussion.
I think the biggest controversy was when we had the previous competencies list and there was level 1 and level 2 competencies. There was a lot of tension about who needed to know level 1 and who needed to know level 2, because we've got some people who do a certain percentage of time in collection development and a certain percentage of time in reference. And it was a question of how much time equaled level 2, and it got a little bit dicey that way, I guess you could say. But I think that one of the good things about the new competencies is that we eliminated that kind of conflict, because we've created something with a much bigger variety of goals. And as Katie said, that they're stepped in difficulty, so that, you know, one year you can do the first goal, next year you can do the second goal, or you can create your own, or what have you.
Excellent, thank you. I think you answered this one a bit, y'all, but we do have one about the extent to which the competencies are connected to librarian review processes. you mentioned that you'd be looking to work that in the future. Is there anything else you'd like to expand on about that since the question was raised?
Well, we were talking about the new librarian starting, and it was, you know, right now she's only been here for like 2 weeks. So having her create her first set of goals, she's got all of those goals document, you know, the competencies document, and she can put that into her goals document, pick and choose from those things, and then she'll be reviewed on those later. So luckily we kind of have a basis by which to start some of these goals documents, and then they are actually reviewed upon those goals.
Okay, great, thanks. And actually, this looks like a related one. Do you have an example of the document, Katie, that new liaisons use or are using that's shareable, I presume is the intent of this question?
Oh, it's the link that's below our names is to our institutional repository, and it links to the competencies document, which is in a training binder that is given to the new employee.
Excellent. And Alex has just posted that in the chat box for those who are interested. Couple questions came in about how you're assessing whether or not a liaison reaches the goals articulated in the competency document, particularly the extent to which they're measurable. So someone tossed out an example of having a working knowledge of copyright and to be familiar with that kind of material, questioning whether or not that's really accessible or measurable.
Well, I think that a lot of it is tied in with our assessment cycle. And the way we do things here is we write up an annual report so that we begin it with a self-assessment. And we would write a couple sentences about how we achieved that particular goal, basically. And then there would be a CV attached or something similar to a CV that would support that claim. I think that it all comes down to what you put into your annual report. What do you guys think?
Well, usually in the reporting cycle, part of making the goals is having multiple drafts of showing how you're going to make it measurable. And I don't think that's a one size fits all. So something like learning about copyright, when I did this in the past, you know, I said I made it measurable by saying I'm going to attend the Scholarly Communication Bootcamp session on copyright, and I'm going to attend at least one other webinar or conference on this, and then I'm also going to review the fair practices document or something. So I made it measurable by saying how I was going to go about doing that. Within the process, that was approved by Cindy, who looks over the collection development goals, and she signed off at that. So they become measurable. They become more measurable in the actual process of creating them. But to determine how somebody's going to go about doing that in this document seems like maybe a step too far. So those example goals are kind of a starter piece, I would say.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, good. I will add that, like, as far as for the bootcamp trainings, we'll use them to sort of base, that's like the level that we're aiming for. So throughout our assessments that we'll be developing this year, that will come out there as far as if we did meet them or if we didn't meet them and if we need to revisit them.
Excellent, thank you. Next question is, to what extent have you been drawing from the ACRL framework given the intersection between ScholComm and information literacy?
Well, as we mentioned, we did review that in RAS as part of our departmental goals and look for ways that we could incorporate that into teaching and learning here at ECU. Although there's 11 people, there's 12 people in RIS, and so each person is going to teach slightly differently. So I would say that we reviewed the document. We've all read it. We've all discussed it, and we've discussed ways in our community of practice for RIS. We've discussed ways that that could be incorporated into an instruction session. As I mentioned before, us getting all together in a big group setting where there's, I think, between RIS, CDV, and Scholarly Communications, there's almost 15, 16 people. So getting us all together at once to have that kind of discussion hasn't happened, but it's also a question of, scheduling that and making sure we do that. But I think that we're all familiar with it, and we're proactively figuring out ways to include it in our classroom setting. If that answers.
Yeah, I'll invite our original question asker, who I think was BB Chang. If you have additional questions about that particular answer that Katie just gave, please feel free to chime in again, BB. Next question is, have you opened up your boot camp to library staff who are not liaisons, but who would benefit from the same types of information, such as access services staff? I see smiling from the panelists.
So that is that's actually come up a few times. I will say the first year that we did it, we had it at our main library and then also at our health sciences library, which is a separate library. And for the health sciences library, they did invite their access services staff to come in for the training. So we had, in those group settings, we actually had a mix of people in there as far as, because they had people on the desk who wanted to be sure that they'd be able to help somebody that came in to answer various questions related to the topics that we were covering. And then as far as here, we did receive feedback from our assessments as to kind of expanding that. And so some of them we have opened them up to the library for anybody to attend that's interested in it, and anybody is welcome to attend at any time. And this really came out of, we have textbook affordability programs, and we do have librarians supporting those faculty that are not necessarily liaison librarians. So some of the topics, specifically open educational resources, Creative Commons licenses, and copyright, those topics were ones that were of particular interest to people supporting faculty in the textbook affordability program. So yes, we have, and we are looking for ways to kind of expand that as well, along with our modules and stuff. Once we create that, that might be something that anyone can use to expand their knowledge. If you want to add. Okay.
Great, thanks. How long were your boot camp sessions? All day?
Oh, no.
They were an hour.
Excellent, easy one.
If you strung them together, they would have been a day the first year, because we did 7 and they were an hour apiece.
So we did them about once a month. We held a topic for an hour, and then since we had it at the health sciences campus as well, we kind of scheduled them either back-to-back weeks so that depending on people's schedule, they could attend as needed.
They also said if you're going to miss it on the main campus, you're encouraged to go over to the health sciences campus if you want. So I don't know how many people really did that, but
A few did.
Yeah, a few did.
And a few health sciences people came over here.
Yes.
Which is actually above and beyond the call of duty with our parking.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Where does any competency with the research life cycle fall into your approach to putting together a ScholarCom competency program? And the question asker says that she likes the idea, but just wondering about this part of it within the general scheme of IL, this particular focus on the research life cycle.
So I guess I could say that for the boot camps, some of our topics we have addressed it in the form of the life cycle. So, for example, we had a session that focused on supporting faculty and researchers with grants. And so that session was specifically addressed at each portion of the life cycle, how we can support researchers with that.
The data one also hit like a specific time or times as well, the data. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, no, but okay.
I think we try to be cognizant of it, of the research life cycle. We try to work it in, but I'm not sure that we're being overt about it, I guess is the answer. And maybe we should think about it more.
Excellent, thank you. Quick one, someone said, sorry if they missed this, but what time of year did you hold the camps? Was it during academic year or summer?
We did fall and spring, so it was during the academic year.
Okay, thank you. Someone else mentioned that they were confused by the term RIS cognate. Can you explain this?
RIS cognate, yes, that was probably on a, okay, so we talked about how our liaison model is a little bit messy, as we said. Some people in RIS have CDV duties, collection development duties, like I'm the main person for modern languages for both the collection development things, the scholarly communication things, and also for research and instructional services. But it's not the same for everybody. For instance, we have a coordinator of instructional assessment, and she teaches all of the social work, sociology, and other social sciences related classes, but there's a collection development liaison who has more of those liaison duties for those departments. And so sometimes they come together to go to meetings, like go to a faculty meeting, or they work together to make sure that, you know, the library is being marketed to those departments and so on. And so it comes from our model, really, that some people have collection development duties and some don't.
Great, thank you. And I think those are all the questions that have come in at this point. We've got a couple minutes before we close, so if anyone's got a last minute question, feel free to place it in the chat box. If we don't see one in just a moment, I think Alex will help us thank the panelists and wrap up.
Yes. Yeah, I don't see any other questions. So I just want to say thank you so much, Cindy, Jeannie, and Katie, and for the presentation. I think it was great, as well as to my co-moderator, Laura, from the ACRL ULS Professional Development Committee. Wrangling those questions can be, you know, quite the chore and things like that, so we really appreciate that. I also want to thank Megan Griffin from ALA for opening up the room for us today. That was really, you know, great that we were able to still get this on, even though the winter that's hitting us here in the Midwest. And I do want to say to please fill out the assessment link that we just sent out. Yep, Laura just sent it out. So we really like to hear feedback on your thoughts on this, on the presentation, and just to fill that out. We also want to mention to make sure to look for upcoming presentations from our committee, with the next presentation being Beyond Library Diversity Residencies, Strategies to Recruit, Retain, and Promote Librarians of Color, which will be on February 19th. So keep an eye out for more information coming out in the next few weeks about that presentation. So thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.